I think the issue about the linkage between military spending and revenues from natural resources in Africa was something that first came to the limelight in the early 1990s when on the global policy arena conceptually, there was that connection between security and development, of which people identified the amount of state resources that is spent on the military as a core issue in rethinking or making a connection between security and development. There and then, there were attempts, or actually not attempts, there were pronouncements by the OECD and a lot of countries that give official development assistance to developing countries, especially in Africa, to streamline the amount of state resources that developing countries that will qualify for development assistance that they can spend on their military. I think a ratio of about 3% of GDP was fixed as the top ceiling for developing countries to spend on their military in the 1990s. With this package, or with this initiative, also came the attempt at reforming the security sector in developing countries. So this was where the issue about the relationship between military spending and state revenue broadly, but more importantly, those that are connected with receipt from natural resources came to the limelight. While some progress were made in certain instances in places like Uganda, in places like Ghana, in places like Zambia, and a few other countries in Africa who qualified for official development assistance, they were made to lower the amount of their GDP that was spent on the military. The events of 9/11 has more or less reversed and rolled back the clock in that regard. But more interesting is that when we talk broadly about the link between revenues from natural resources and military expenditure, I think it is often an issue that is clouded with a lot of conjectures, a lot of unproven, unscientific assumptions, a lot of intuition, because people tend to simplify the issues by rationalizing that once a state earns more money from natural resources, the tendency or automatically translates into increased spending on the military. That is often not the case. Actually, the connection, the linkage between incomes and revenues from natural resources and military expenditure is much more complex than people tend to assume. More often, the connection between these two things, they are mixed and they are inconclusive, meaning that military expenditure do go up even when states do not get increase in revenues from natural resources and vice versa. And even where states over a 3 or 4 year period witness increases in levels of military spending, you could have the odd 1 year or two where that would defy, the trend. So the connection between increase in military spending and income from natural resources is extremely very complex that needs to be properly investigated. The need for this proper scientific investigation, especially in the context of Africa, arises because of the increasing energy profile of the continent, especially in and around the Gulf of Guinea corridor. That is in relation to hydrocarbons, where more and more states are becoming oil-producing states. Oil discoveries are being made and are being made in countries like Uganda, which is starting to produce oil now, the same as in Ghana. You also go, a lot of oil prospecting activities going on in places around Liberia, in Sierra Leone, even in the troubled Cote d'Ivoire. So the increasing energy profile of Africa means that there is need to invest in investigating this connection. But what are the key things I would like to share with you today? After my opening talk is that despite the fact that the connection between incomes from natural resources and military spending, that the connection is mixed, is inconclusive, is complex and complicated. One can come to an initial conclusion, which is that at best, higher earnings from natural resources do increase the likelihood of higher millets, but this is not always certain. This is something that needs to be taken with caution. What is the nature of military expenditure in Africa? The nature of military expenditure in Africa is that several variables interact to influence the levels and composition of millets in Africa. Typically, economic growth, political consideration, security needs, especially where there are cases of breaches of peace and security or armed conflict, both low intensity and high intensity conflict, as well as revenue from natural resources and specialist programs such as security sector reform that tend to involve a lot of financial resources. They all combine to interact and determine levels of military expenditure in Africa. Moreover, military expenditure in Africa, typical to a lot of developing countries as broadly, tends to rise quickly but tends to be sluggish in falling down. Third is also that military expenditure can and do rise during period of economic growth and decline. And it can also rise during period of increase and decreased revenue. And I think this talks about the complex interface. Finally is that MILEX increases is generally lower and slower compared to economic growth. Even where military expenditure in Africa has been rising in the last decade or so, if you compare it with the rate of economic growth, you will notice that military expenditure is only marginally increasing relative to economic growth. So there is a lot of myth and conjectures about the connection between military expenditure and incomes from natural resources. Talking more specifically about the relationship between military expenditure and natural resources in Africa, there are three important points to note. The first is that the nature, the type, and strategic profile of a particular natural resource influence military spending in different ways. In a sense, different natural resources could have different impact on levels of millets. The way hydrocarbon resources like oil and gas will influence levels of millets is not the way diamonds or even agricultural products or even mineral resources like uranium or coltan will influence levels of military spending. So the nature of natural resources, the differences in their strategic profile, their pricing and marketing strategies on the global arena do interact or do have implication for the kind of connections it has with military spending. Finally, is that the strategic natural resources, especially hydrocarbons, they tend to have more impact on millets, and that is what I will focus in the next few minutes. Oil and millets in Africa. Oil-producing states in Africa, especially Algeria, oil and gas-producing states in Africa, especially Algeria, Angola, Nigeria, Chad, Libya, Sudan, and others, are amongst the biggest spenders in Africa. I think if I can give a rough estimate, the oil-producing states in Africa, when you come, they account for nearly 60% of military spending in the entire region. And again, this speaks to there is something there in terms of a connection. But what needs to be properly understood is the realities, the fact about that connection. Secondly is that in most cases, changes, especially increases in African millets, tend to reflect changes in the millets of oil states. It means that the larger trend for Africa as a region tends to be tied to the trends noticeable among oil-producing states. In 2010, for instance, there was $800 million worth of increase in military spending in Africa. 600 million of this is down to the increase in military spending by one country, which is an oil-producing state, which is Angola. So that again speaks volume to how oil-producing states influence the trend in Africa. Third is that high oil prices and output, which tends to lead to increased revenue, especially in the last decade where oil prices tend to have increased, have accompanied increases in millets of oil states in the last decade. Again, this talks to those connections I mentioned earlier on. However, the MILEX share of GDP is mostly steady or marginally increasing. That despite higher earnings from oil, the MILEX share of GDP has not increased at the same rate. So it is not straightforward that increases in MILEX translate into that increases in oil prices and oil revenue translate into increases in MILEX in Africa. Finally, it is not just higher earnings, but also the securitization and the emergence of genuine security needs associated with the production in oil and gas that tend to account for the connection, especially at the level of increase between MILEX and earnings from natural resources. In a sense, you have a vicious circle whereby a particular natural resource, especially production of oil, assumes a national security dimension, which necessitates upping the security in and around the production facility. And that, again, where it has taken place in a few countries, has had negative impact on the security situation, whereby locals have resisted, state production of those resources, and then you have low-intensity conflict. I will share a few examples with you. Take, for instance, Nigeria. The blue line indicate oil output, while the purple line indicate MILEX. You can see that oil output, even where it is increasing, MILEX is dropped. And even where oil output drops, MILEX goes up, and vice versa. So you can see that complex interaction between levels of MILEX and oil output. Another example is the case of Algeria. Again, you can see MILEX this time around is the blue, and oil is the purple. You can see, even though there is almost a kind of similarity in trend, but at some point in the middle, you can see that increases in MILEX is not matched by increases in oil output. You can see that reverse connection. Another example, which is very, very instructive, is the case of Chad. When the Chad-Cameroon pipeline started operating, before the pipeline was finished in the early 2000s, Chad's oil production was very minimal. We didn't have data for that break. But what happened was that the moment the oil production went up in Chad, you can also see MILEX also jumping up. But it is not just the reality of increased revenue that explains that. Chad had to deal with a very serious rebellion at that moment, where actually the government was sacked from the capital city. The government had to reclaim the capital city from rebels from northern Chad. So it is not just the fact that there was more money, but there was a serious security need on the part of Chad. And then the case of Angola, again, talks about that very inconclusive, very complex relationship between earnings from military expenditure, earnings from oil and gas production, and levels of military expenditure. I'll leave it at that now. Hopefully, maybe a few more issues can be, will come up at questions.